Hello guys, welcome to the video. It's going to be a long one this time. My god, I was writing all day. So, here we go. Hello guys, welcome to the video. It's going to be a long one this time. My god, I was writing all day. So, here we go. Welcome to the Peacemaker Breakdown. If you are new, I make videos where I break down how superheroes fight, how deadly they would be in real life, and so on and so forth. So, obvious spoilers for Peacemaker and the Suicide Squad ahead. First, we'll discuss Peacemaker's physique. Peacemaker is very jacked. He clearly takes a bodybuilding approach to muscle building. His physique is something that would take years of weightlifting to build, and of course, at least some amount of PEDs. If you aren't really a part of the fitness community, you might be surprised to learn that a lot of your favorite actors are lying to you about how they stay in shape. There is no secret chicken and broccoli diet, and no super work ethic. Everyone does basically the same shit to build muscle. Lift weights multiple times a week with progressive overload, replenish with a relatively healthy diet, protein, and a decent amount of sleep. Eventually, you can incorporate things like creatine and protein powder, which is what I use, but even that, you can only reach a certain threshold. Eventually, to get a physique where your body is holding that amount of muscle while maintaining that low of a body fat percentage requires intake of some level of PEDs, such as steroids or SARMs. A pretty good way to guess if someone is on PEDs is seeing how much muscle their body holds while being shredded. Anyway, I don't think John Cena himself deserves much flack because he is someone who at least implies that he's on PEDs, and he's not selling any fitness plans, unlike some other actors. Rant aside, having a physique like Peacemaker would give decent advantages in strength, obviously, and potentially explosive capability, depending on how he trained. In MMA, we have seen fighters perform with and without PEDs, and the difference is a pretty clear advantage in knockout capability, stronger chins, likely due to increased muscle in the neck and traps, and increased strength in controlling opponents in grappling situations. There are some disadvantages in carrying a lot of muscle, namely cardio. Fighters like Tyron Woodley, Yoel Romero, and Rumble Johnson were basically forced to fight in a very defensive and slow style with occasional explosive movements, usually in the opening rounds. By the end of round 5, they would either have thrown very little volume throughout the fight, or they would be completely gassed out, not even able to get off of their stool, as with the famous Yoel Romero incident. So nowadays, fighters implement other PEDs and such to also expand their cardio while expanding how much muscle they can hold, but that's really another topic for another day, and it's better gleaned from a channel like More Plates, More Dates. So from a martial arts perspective, Peacemaker doesn't necessarily demonstrate technique or skill that I could associate with MMA fighters or martial artists. While engaging in hand-to-hand combat, Peacemaker typically uses some sloppy boxing and will pick up and throw enemies and maybe throw a knee or a kick once in a while. I don't think that's the actual intention of the director or the choreographers, due to the fact that, at least in the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker is shown to be so proficient in martial arts that he can confidently kill a man with one strike while handcuffed. So I think Peacemaker is generally meant to fight with a kind of a heavy-handed boxing style, mixed in with some Greco-wrestling, perhaps a bit of judo, and maybe pepper in some knees, and perhaps Muay Thai style of leg kicks. His go-to would probably be a strong overhand right with a good double leg, which is typical of a lot of these kind of stockier, more heavily muscled MMA fighters. Now, it's time to get into Peacemaker's weapons, starting with his numerous and hilarious helmets. Granted, we don't see each of these helmets in use, but we do have a few scenes where the helmets are named. First of all, helmets are very important in any form of combat. The head is the most important part of the body, and protecting it is obviously paramount, whether that be from falling rubble, strikes, or bullets. Each of Peacemaker's helmets are implied to be bulletproof and protect the upper half of his face. This is actually a pretty big advantage over heroes like Nightwing or Robin, who are a lot more vulnerable. Even in real life, modern soldiers wear helmets, and in the past, the helmet was seen as the most crucial piece of armor. Other advantages are the ability to give really strong headbutts without having to worry about taking as much damage. For example, it is relatively easy to get into a mount position, control the arms, and then just headbutt away, which was the go-to move of former UFC heavyweight champ Mark Coleman. So let's get into the powers. We have full body force field, which we never see used, but would arguably be the most useful helmet to have, depending of course on how long it stays active and how powerful it is. Then we have sonic boom, which allows for 4 blasts that basically vaporize anything within maybe 20 to 30 feet, except for the user. An extremely useful helmet for most situations, except perhaps when indoors or when fighting with teammates. The helmet can also be used remotely with a walkie-talkie like in the show. Then there's the X-ray helmet, which doesn't just let you see through people like real X-rays, but also lets you see through things like doors and walls. This helmet is surprisingly useful in situations like room clearing and recon. Next we have the Breathe Underwater helmet, which is very situational, but not terrible. Think about how useful a helmet like that would be to a group of Navy SEALs or maybe Marine recon. Then there's also the Scabies for All helmet, which gives scabies to everyone within a mile radius. Scabies is a skin disease caused by a parasite, which kind of just makes you mildly itchy and causes a rash. Annoying to be sure, but this helmet is pretty limited in its viability, unless, say, Peacemaker needed to make a lot of money quickly by selling a lot of anti-itch cream. So next is the anti-gravity helmet, which in the show is kind of played off as a joke, but this helmet could actually be pretty damn cool to use. If you've ever seen Hereditary, you know what I'm talking about. This would be pretty great for sneaking away, setting up ambushes, or even room clearing. No one is going to be expecting you to be crawling around the ceiling and shooting down. This helmet is potentially the most dangerous to the user, as you could end up floating away and having a difficult time trying to land. Come to think of it, you could probably jump out of a plane with this helmet and activate it before you hit the ground and survive without even needing a parachute. Lastly, we have the Human Torpedo helmet, which is not the most useful, but it still has its moments. It seems like it's really hard to aim and does a lot of damage to the wearer, but it does allow you to shoot yourself like a torpedo, which can be great for moving out of the way, or even just aiming your head and torpedoing through a person. It is viable, but you just gotta watch out for walls. So that's all the helmets that we know of so far. I think Peacemaker should probably always use the full body force field helmet as a default, depending again on how good the force field is. The Sonic Boom helmet is a good second choice, especially if he knows he'll be fighting a superpower opponent like the Flash or something. If he's going to be doing close quarters building clearing, he should bring the X-ray helmet instead. Just because if he uses the Sonic Boom helmet, he might just bring the whole building onto himself after the initial explosion, and again, the X-ray helmet is very useful in that situation. And if he needs to infiltrate somewhere, then it might be useful to bring the anti-gravity helmet for aerial insertions or the underwater helmet for water insertions. The Scabies and the Human Torpedo helmets should probably be left alone for the most part, but they're still probably better to have than a helmet with no powers or no helmet, if they are his only options. So now let's get a little bit into the firearms. Peacemaker uses a wide range of firearms. Basically, he will use anything required by the situation, which is great as a lot of superhero or supervillain characters tend to only use one trademark weapon that is not always the best for the situation. I'd like to see Peacemaker use rifles a bit more than he does, but honestly, the fact that he is even willing to use firearms is pretty good for him. Peacemaker's trademark gun is his pistol. Pistols are great. They're not as great as rifles, but are still immensely useful. It's a good thing he always carries it around. Additionally, Peacemaker has access to explosive rounds, which open up his potential for causing damage to structures and vehicles, as well as superpowered opponents with advanced durability or armor like his father. Peacemaker demonstrates that he is a master of firearms, although his actual tactics may be somewhat questionable. He doesn't really move around like a soldier or a cop would when clearing rooms, and doesn't really take efforts to protect himself like laying down when he's shooting in an open field. But I suppose there are arguments that can be made that he was confident enough to fight the way he did, and he only had enough ammo, so it would be better that he ran in with his gun and then switched to his melee weapons. I mean, that argument can be made. Peacemaker also uses a blowgun for near silent ranged kills. I love it. Blowguns are shown to be surprisingly powerful, enough to take down large game like bears by going straight through muscles, organs, and sometimes even bone. However, I've only seen this done with a much larger blowgun than the one the Peacemaker used, which is about the size of a straw. But either way, it's still a viable way to take people down at range and adds an extra wrinkle to Peacemaker's options for when he's attacking. Peacemaker also uses a hand axe. It seems like it's kind of more like a hatchet, but he uses it almost like a tomahawk. I think the design of this weapon could be improved by making the head a bit smaller with less surface area to be more akin to a tomahawk, but that's just my opinion. Soldiers in the modern day actually sometimes carry things like this and use them to silently kill enemies. How often they get to do that kind of depends. I heard a Green Beret talking about it on a podcast. He and some of his team were using tomahawks in Afghanistan. Also, there are records of tomahawks being used in Vietnam as well, to varying degrees of effect, I'm sure. The same thing can also be said for Peacemaker's knife. He hasn't really had the best track record with knives. I mean, he stabbed Vigilante by accident. Every time he's pulled out a knife, he hasn't really killed anyone with it. But what can I say? They have their clear uses. He's not as good with them as Vigilante, who can throw knives like a champ, but it's not a bad idea to carry a knife. Even in the Suicide Squad, he was confident he could use a switchblade against scores of soldiers that were entering the bar he was in. My guess, though, is his plan probably wasn't to stab each soldier. It was probably to stab one soldier and then take his firearm and use the civilians as cover in the crowded bar. Which does make it fortunate that Bloodsport decided to surrender before that happened, because Peacemaker at that point definitely would have done something like that. Peacemaker also uses a sword. It's a bit different than the one Vigilante or Bloodsport uses. It's two-handed with a more European design, as opposed to the Chinese Dadao inspiration for Vigilante's sword, or the Japanese katana inspiration for Bloodsport's sword. That being said, it seems like Peacemaker's sword was kind of short for being two-handed, but considering it is a backup weapon, it's probably fine. It's not like he's going to be having a one-on-one sword fight with a fencer or someone with a rapier or a longsword, where that extra little bit would be very important. He's just going to use it for surprise attacks. Peacemaker also uses a shield like a badass. His shield is bulletproof, at least to small caliber ammunition, and is sharp enough to slice through bone. Shields like this are pretty viable in ancient combat, especially when one isn't wearing armor. In modern day, it might be more trouble than it's worth, but given its bulletproof nature and that Peacemaker prefers to use his handgun, it could be fine, kind of like how riot cops or SWAT sometimes carry shields. Last but not least, we have Eagley. Eagley is shown to be pretty smart. He isn't smart enough to do complex tasks, but he has been trained to take down opponents, fighting the Peacemaker to devastating effect. Having a trained eagle that can scratch out the eyes of opponents or even kill them by biting into their necks is extremely useful. We see in the show that Eagley has enough power to knock down adults, which in itself would be useful. There really is no downside to having Eagley around, unless maybe Eagley blows his cover by cawing, but who's gonna hear like an eagle screaming and think, oh, it's the Peacemaker? I mean, they'd probably just think it's a bird. There's my version of Eagley. I don't know if you can see. Yeah. She's probably about the same. No, probably dumber. Anyway. Peacemaker also demonstrates some capability with explosives like dynamite and C4, but hasn't really shown to implement them very often. I think adding grenades and flashbangs to his repertoire would be more useful than, say, his sword or blowgun. So based on all his weapons and fighting styles, I think that Peacemaker at his absolute best can hold a 10 on the danger scale, making him the most deadly character I've covered so far. But that being said, he usually isn't utilizing his best equipment all at the same time. For instance, in the Suicide Squad, the only firearm he brought was a pistol, and he was wearing a helmet that didn't have any superpowers. He also goes into battle with things like swords and shields, while he would be better off with firearms or explosives. Peacemaker, with time to prepare, often shows up as maybe even as low as a 7 out of 10 on the danger scale. However, at his deadliest, when he is wearing his sonic boom helmet, has a rifle, has his pistol, has explosives, maybe his blowgun or a tomahawk and a knife, he is definitely at a 10 out of 10 on the danger scale. Lastly, what is the best way to defeat the Peacemaker? Like Vigilante, Peacemaker is extremely mentally disturbed and not very intelligent outside of direct combat. He's not as gullible as Vigilante, but the best way to defeat him is probably to trick him into going after some supervillain, but then the cops just show up and arrest him. Peacemaker probably won't kill police officers and might even surrender if he is against an overwhelming police force. Additionally, Peacemaker is vulnerable to being shot unless he has his force field up. So sneak attacks are probably going to be pretty viable against him. So that's the video, guys. Thanks for watching the series. You can check out my other videos discussing Vigilante, Judo Master, and scores of other heroes and villains. But other than that, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.